Hi, my name is Sophie, and today I'm going to be talking about the research being done by the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project at the University of Washington. My colleagues and I will discuss what racial restrictive covenants are and why our team studies them, our data collection and mapping process, the local history of segregation in Seattle and King County, the eventual end of these restrictive covenants, and their lasting effects in our communities today. I will begin by defining racial restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants were restrictions legally recorded by one or more property owners, which bound them and all future property owners not to sell, lease, or rent their property to specified racial or religious groups. These were legally enforceable clauses in deeds and other property records. All of the examples shown on the slide are of restrictive covenants taken from property records in King County. We're going to go into more depth later about some of the language used in these covenants, but it's important to note that they were very explicit and denied property to specific people based on their racial or ethnic group. The Racial Restrictive Covenants Project initially began in 2005 under the direction of Dr. James Gregory. In March of 2021, SHB 1335 was passed, and our team was tasked with mapping and identifying racially restrictive covenants in every county across the state. The project is divided into two teams. Our team, based here at the University of Washington, is responsible for researching all of the counties west of the Cascades, and the team at Eastern Washington University handles everything east of the Cascades. Not every county has its records digitized, and a lot of our research takes place in the archives, flipping through hundreds of pages of old deed volumes or slowly scrolling through microfilm. As I'm sure you can imagine, flipping through books of deeds and rolls of microfilm is not ideal for this large of a research project. The best case scenario is when counties have digital records that we can scan using OCR technology. When we started this project, King County had only part of their records digitized, and with over 1 million records to look at by hand, we knew this wasn't going to be feasible. And so last autumn, we rented a high-speed scanner, and our team spent months in the office digitizing this microfilm. After this microfilm and other documents are digitized, we upload them to Zooniverse, which is an online program that allows people to get involved in real ongoing research. We regularly host events where we orient people towards Zooniverse, and we've had over 1,000 volunteers to date from Seattle Central College, students at local high schools, and even local law groups. This is a great way to help with the project because people can contribute without leaving the comfort of their home, and it's a crucial part of the research we do. We're really thankful for all of our volunteers and all of the assistance they give us, and appreciate any help that you give us on this project. This is a screenshot of our map of restrictions in King County. So far, our team at UW has identified about 50,000 restrictions in the state of Washington, including 34,000 in King County, 4,000 in Snohomish County, 5,000 in Pierce and Spokane counties, and a few thousand in some of the smaller counties around the Puget Sound. This is an interactive map that can be explored further online, where you can zoom in and look at the individual properties and restrictions. Please note that these restrictions shown on our maps also reflect the timing of housing development, and areas that were newly subdivided between 1926 and 1952 were most likely to be restricted in their deeds, because it was easier for developers to put restrictions on new subdivisions rather than existing ones. Our maps are also incomplete because they are still in the process of ongoing research, and we should note that areas that appear not to have restrictions were often restricted by other means such as violence, social enforcement, and the actions of police officers and realtors.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma, and I'm going to be discussing the role of the real estate industry. So who started this? The real estate industry conducted campaigns in cities across the country, starting in the 1920s, to convince developers and property owners to register racially restrictive covenants. In 1926, the Supreme Court ruled that the racist restrictions were legal and enforceable. Until 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in their code of ethics against selling homes to a person of color because they claimed it would be destructive to the property values of the neighborhood. Most banks, loan companies, title, insurance, and real estate men were closely affiliated with the real estate board and upheld their code of ethics. Almost all of the Seattle real estate men were members of the National Association and upheld their code of ethics here. It's important to clarify that while racially restrictive covenants were promoted by real estate professionals, the federal government also had a hand in segregation and housing discrimination through the practice of redlining. After millions of Americans lost their homes during the Great Depression and the collapse of the housing lending industries, the federal government established the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Authority, which provided a lifeline by granting new long-term mortgages to existing homeowners and subsidizing new lending backed by government insurance. These developments transformed the United States into a homeowners nation, or at least a nation where most white families owned homes. The famous redlining maps were a part of this. They were produced in 1936 by the Homeowners Loan Corporation to advise mortgage lenders where their investments would be safe. Any neighborhood where Black or Asian people lived was deemed hazardous to lenders' investments and colored red on the map. Because of this designation, the Federal Housing Authority refused to underwrite mortgages to people of color, and it typically denied insurance to families of color. The inability of people of color to access mortgage assistance made it extraordinarily difficult for them to get in on the home ownership boom that was being enjoyed by white Americans across the country. With no way to build wealth through housing appreciation, Black and Asian families were at a systemic disadvantage in achieving stability and prosperity of the coveted American dream, a disadvantage that continues to have intergenerational consequences. I'm now going to transition to focusing on racial segregation in Seattle and King County. Seattle has a long history of racial discrimination and segregation. For many generations, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were shut out of neighborhoods, schools, many occupations, and sometimes even shops and restaurants. In the 1860s, Indigenous Americans were banned from Seattle, despite Seattle being located on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Chinese people were also driven out of Seattle in the 1886 labor riots, and those that returned were restricted, both in employment and housing opportunities. The map here on the right shows where most non-white people lived in Seattle during the 1940s. As you can see, non-white people were heavily concentrated, in fact confined, in a portion of the Central District, indicated by the color red on the map, indicating and showing the extent to which the country was segregated. Although many assumed the Pacific Northwest was immune to segregation, like that of the Jim Crow South, it's important to acknowledge that the Pacific Northwest practiced active racial discrimination for a very long time. In most southern states, segregation of schools, buses, restaurants, and public facilities were required by law. Although this was not the case in Washington state, local government agencies supported discrimination and segregation in various ways, including the certification of racial restrictive covenants and encouraging police to harass Black individuals seen in white neighborhoods. Seattle segregation practices extended beyond housing. Black and Asian Americans were often denied service in bars, restaurants, barbershops, and even in hospitals. This is a picture of Coon Chicken Inn, a restaurant which was located in Lake City until the 1950s. This restaurant illustrates the prevalence of overt racism and racial discrimination in King County.
Hi there, my name's Ari, and we're now going to highlight some local restriction stories. William Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft, is an example of a prominent Seattle resident that often bought and restricted entire subdivisions. He and his wife Bertha purchased large tracts of land in what is now Northwest Seattle and Shoreline. All of his subdivisions were restricted to people that were white or Caucasian only. To demonstrate the extent of his restrictive tendencies, in just 4 subdivisions alone, the Boeings restricted a total of 960 properties to white people only. Now, it got a bit more complicated to impose restrictions on older neighborhoods due to existing property deeds. As a result of this, neighborhood associations sometimes organize petition campaigns to convince fellow residents to bind their properties with a racial covenant. One of the best documented efforts of this restricted most blocks in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Starting in 1927, the Capitol Hill Community Club organized a 3-year campaign during which 964 properties owners signed petition covenants restricting 183 blocks and ultimately 958 lots of property from Black people. The targets of restrictions and the language that used varied greatly depending on the area. Many restrictions simply said white or Caucasian only, but others targeted specific groups, and the language was often offensive and confusing to those who see the terminology today.
For instance, many restrictions, like this one for Sunnydale Gardens in Tukwila, used the term Ethiopian to refer to any Black person regardless of their ethnic origin, and Malay generally referred to Filipinos. Many covenants made explicit exceptions for the case of live-in domestic servants, as that work was dominated by Black women and Asian men. And here is one that is truly eye-opening. The man who sold a small group of properties in Clyde Hill restricted it to members of the Aryan race, invoking Hitler's racial categories. And what is worse, he added this restriction in 1946 and 1947. This was after Hitler was dead, Nazi war crimes and the Holocaust were known worldwide, and the Nuremberg trials and executions had already taken place. And this restriction in Ladd's second edition has clear connotations of American slavery. Now, even though the use of restricted covenants was prevalent, they were not the most powerful tool of segregation, and the fact that we have found few or none in some neighborhoods does not mean that they were not segregated. Social means, violence, harassment, and the actions of realtors were the large forces in keeping certain racial or religious groups out of certain areas. The social enforcement was often handled by real estate agents who blocked access and by angry white neighbors and community members who harassed and threatened them. And if that failed, then real violence followed. An instance of this is the bombing of the home of Carl Brooks and his family in Shoreline. After Carl Brooks, a civil rights activist, and his family moved into the restricted neighborhood of Lago Vista, their family was harassed, and after harassment did not cause the Brooks family to leave, race terrorists threw a dynamite bomb into their home, shattering windows and endangering the lives of 2 sleeping children. This act of terror was not even reported in the major daily newspapers, but only reported in this left-wing weekly newspaper. The fact that this explicit act of racially motivated terror was ignored by the major media of the time indicates how pervasive and unanimous the consensus of segregation among institutions of power was. This article, on the left side of the screen, states that the sheriff's office at the time condoned the campaign of intimidation that preceded the dynamite throwing. This is a prime example of sundown town law enforcement. Until the late 1960s, Seattle and other police forces in King County enforced informal sundown rules and zones. In the evenings after work, African Americans were not supposed to be in white neighborhoods, and they would often be stopped, questioned, and harassed if they were seen in one. These sundown zones highlight the social enforcement that accompanied or acted as a substitute for the use of racial restrictive covenants to ensure the segregation of King County and demonstrate how practices of social enforcement were often allowed to continue and are often supported by those in power.
Hello, my name is Amanda, and I am now going to talk about efforts to protest and end restrictive covenants. The NAACP filed numerous lawsuits challenging them. In 1948, the Supreme Court reversed its previous decision with the Shelley v. Kramer case filed by the NAACP in St. Louis. The ruling said that state courts should no longer enforce restrictive covenants. However, this ruling practically changed very little. Restrictive covenants remained perfectly legal, and new restrictions were added to subdivisions and recorded by county auditors well into the 1960s. And as before, segregation was enforced by other means. Civil rights activists also tried to change the law without success in our region. In 1964, after 40 cities had already passed laws banning discrimination in housing, Seattle citizens voted against the measure 2-1. Here is a newspaper ad paid for by the real estate industry claiming that the proposed law violated property rights. Finally, in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which declared that it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, or religion in housing. The legislature followed up in 1969 by voiding the discriminatory provisions in real estate contracts. But just to emphasize how little changed in the 20 years after Shelley, here is an incident of housing terror that took place in the area near the University of Washington in 1958. Marion West, who was white, was able to buy a small rooming house with her husband Ray, who was black. They rented rooms to students of color who otherwise found it difficult to find housing near campus. But after years of harassment culminating in a cross being burned on their lawn, they were forced to move to the Central District. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but it wasn't until 1980 that we began to see a process of desegregation. And even now, with the most recent census data, the story is complicated. You can follow the changes decade by decade since 1960 on the slides. These maps show the changing residential patterns for people of various Asian ancestries. It is important to understand that there are multiple factors at work here. Massive immigration has transformed Asian American populations since 1980, and these maps really tell a story about population growth. Immigration from all parts of Asia has increased the Asian American and Pacific Islander population in King County by a factor of 8 since 1980, from 58,000 to 450,000. By 2020, Asian Americans are living in all parts of King County for the most part. However, the maps and stories for African Americans are different. The Black population has increased more slowly, from 56,000 in 1980 to 144,000 in 2020. On the slides are maps of African American residential distributions in 1960, 1980, and 2020, and show that the road to desegregating Seattle has been slow and uneven. You can see that Black Americans are mostly moving south rather than east, north, or west, and much of that relocation has not been voluntary. The Central District, which is the city's historically Black neighborhood, has been the target of gentrification since the 1980s. And while that may have been beneficial for some homeowners who were looking to sell, it was a nightmare for renters who had been locked out of homeownership and were now forced out of their homes and apartments. Census tracts that were 90% Black in 1970 are now 90% not Black. And if you look at the rest of the map, North Seattle still remains 75% white, and 58% of Black or white families would have to move to achieve full integration. Overall, desegregation has been slow and unevenly distributed across different groups.
These maps and stories are not just history, and this history continues to reproduce inequality generation after generation in King County and across Washington state. Restrictions suppressed homeownership and wealth-building opportunities for Americans of color who were locked out of most neighborhoods and had trouble obtaining loans because of redlining during the post-war decades when federal subsidies helped most white families become homeowners. As restrictions eased in the decades since the 1970s, it was honestly too late for many families. Rising prices then became an enormous obstacle to homeownership. This is why families of color are less likely to own homes, and their homes are worth less on average than their white counterparts who have been accumulating generational real estate wealth for many more years. Look at this graph, which shows homeownership rates since 1970. In the most recent census, the disparity is beyond alarming. While 62% of white families are homeowners, only 28% of Black families in the area are. 28% is much lower than the national average of 44% and nearly the lowest in the country, lower than other high-priced cities like Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And the trend line is even more alarming. While 50 years ago in 1970, half of Black families owned homes, this rate has only fallen decade after decade. Why is this? The answer lies in home equity and price escalation. On this slide, you can see the median prices by race and decade. Homes owned by Black, Indigenous, and Latino families in King County have consistently been worth less than those owned by white families. Look at the exponential rise in property value since 1970. This helps explain why it was so difficult for families of color who had been locked out of the housing market prior to the 1970s found it so difficult to acquire homes. In 2022, the median home in King County was valued at more than 35 times as much as in 1970. That's a shift from around $22,000 to almost $800,000 on average. This far exceeded the overall inflation and the rate of increase of family incomes, which only increased by a factor of around 10% during the same time period. While a family selling a full valued home could take advantage of this rocketing market, exchanging one home for another, or dispersing housing assets through inheritance, a family trying to buy for the first time in the post-covenant restriction decades, and for those selling undervalued homes, you would need a much higher income in order to get started. The point is that in the last 3 decades, buyers have needed wealth to get started. Wealth in the form of inheritance or high-paying jobs. Highly paid business and professional class migrants from California, New York, and across the Pacific have been able to join this pricey housing market, while those with average incomes and without family property wealth have lost out. The enormous disadvantage that Black families face in King County is made even clearer when we consider income. At every income level, white families are more likely to own homes than Black families. The chart below shows ownership rates in 2022 census counts. The gap is about 10% for high incomes and then becomes 20% for middle income families. This gap is huge below the $75,000 line, and among those earning less than $50,000, while white families are 4 times more likely to be homeowners than Black families. Remarkably, 38% of white families at this modest income level own homes. It is here that we see the effects of multi-generational wealth building. At current prices, buyers with modest incomes are shut out of homeownership unless they are converting homes long held in the family or other sources of wealth. Now let's talk about some of the good news. Last year, the legislature passed a pioneering law sponsored by Representative Taylor, Representative Frank Chop, and State Senator John Lovick. It is a first-in-the-nation effort to provide financial compensation to the victims of generations of government-sponsored housing discrimination. It took effect on July 1st and should make an important impact on these housing statistics. Lawmakers crafted the Covenant Homeownership Act to compensate the victims of housing exclusion and their descendants. Recognizing that legal challenges might arise from a race-based law, they made it harm-based under the legal principle of tort, meaning if I harm you, I am liable for damages. So in this case, the state is liable for these financial damages. The legislation first establishes that the state of Washington was both an active and passive participant in discrimination that caused financial harm. Then it provides compensation in the form of mortgage assistance, which is no interest loans to be put towards a down payment on a home, for families excluded from equal housing opportunities in the years before the 1968 Fair Housing Act. This legislation also covers their descendants. So to qualify for this assistance, applicants must be first-time homebuyers with incomes at or below the area median. They must have been a Washington state resident before 1968 or a descendant of someone who was and would have been affected by these restrictions. And they must be part of communities that are still feeling the effects of housing segregation today. You can learn more about the Covenant Homeownership Act online or on the Racial Restrictive Covenants website. So some of our key takeaways from today, we talked about racial restrictive covenants, what they are and how they're distinct from other practices of segregation like redlining. We talked about King County's prevalent history of segregation and racial exclusion and the way that that manifested in housing assets and wealth. We talked about how covenants were used widely in King County and Washington state, but were by no means the only way of enforcing segregation. This was also carried out by social means of violence, the actions of realtors, and by community members. We also talked about the legacy of racial restrictive covenants and other means of housing segregation. And I also encourage you all to explore the website more, take a look at the live maps that we have, and if you have the time, take a look at Zooniverse and give us some help looking through and reviewing these documents. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something today. Bye.